This program is supported by grants from the Solon and Martha Dixon Foundation and the Alabama Wildlife Federation, working for wildlife since 1935. Discovering Alabama is a production of the Alabama Museum of Natural History.
Creepy, crawly critters. Those little creatures that can scare us or disgust us, sometimes bite us, sometimes sting us, and yet often captivate us with their interesting shapes and designs and their impressive capabilities.
Insects. Though some folks may think of them mainly as bugging us, we could not live without them.
They are basic to the continuation of life on Earth, essential to sustaining the balance of nature, and yes, vital to the existence of we humans.
I'm Doug Phillips. Join me as we look at the wonder of insects. We'll explore their great variety. We'll examine their role in the ecosystem. And we'll visit with some insect experts, some entomologists, who will tell us things about these creatures we may find surprising, even fascinating.
This program is about a land unknown to many people, a land that in many ways has maintained its native natural wonders, a place of bountiful backcountry, forests, streams, and wildlife more diverse than can be found in much of the inhabited world. Come along with me as we explore the wild wonders of this land. Come along as we discover Alabama.
Welcome to Discovering Alabama, and welcome to the world of insects. Unless one of their species happens to float by in front of our face, we probably don't think much about them. Yet, they're all around us, everywhere all around us. In fact, you might say we live in their world.
Insects inhabit the air. They inhabit the ground. They live in the trees, the shrubs and grasses. They dwell in our streams, lakes, and wetlands. Their presence is an intrinsic wonder of the creation.
Now, before you start scratching your head and asking insect wonders, what about the insect horrors? Certainly, some insects are responsible for some really bad problems, devastating crop damage, structural damage to our homes, and some insects transmit serious illnesses and deadly diseases. Most of us, though, are aware of these problems from some insects. Maybe we aren't always so aware of the fundamental role that the greater world of insects provides for much of the planet's life support system.
Insects perform many indispensable biological services, removing waste materials, decomposing dead organisms, aerating and fertilizing the soil, and capturing and transferring important nutrients critical to the food chain.
And you don't really understand the impact that one insect may have. If you think it's negative, let's get rid of it. But it may be in doing other things that you're not aware of. You discover when you begin to study the life cycle of certain insects, there's a lot going on there that you didn't realize.
Insects are pivotal to the health of the planet because they serve for many different groups of animals as a basis of the food chain. Many insects will eat plants, and then many birds and mammals, reptiles, amphibians will then in turn eat the insects.
The class of animals called insects, from butterflies to bees to beetles, comprises the greatest diversity of species on Earth and the greatest number of animals on Earth. It's estimated there are 200 million insects for each one of us. And not only do they outnumber us, they've been around a lot longer than we have.
So insects have been around for about 480 million years. And if you compare that to man, we've been around for about 5 million years. So insects have been around long before we were, long before the dinosaurs. The groups that we're most familiar with, like beetles, like wasps, like roaches, like grasshoppers, those all started coming online about 250 million years ago. So even the groups that we're familiar with have been around way longer than we have.
So the lowly cockroach was around before dinosaurs and way before we humans. How humiliating. But before we go any further, a quick note.
Entomologists, the folks that study insects, want us to get something straight right away.
An insect is an organism that has 3 body parts and 6 legs. Any organism that has fewer or more than 3 body parts, for example, spiders and scorpions are in a different group of insects. They're arachnids. They have 2 body segments and at least 8 legs.
There's a particular group of insects, an order of insects, the Hemiptera, that are called true bugs. And these are insects that we're all familiar with. We're talking about things like cicadas and stink bugs. And these are true bugs. So it's appropriate to call those bugs, but not appropriate to call a dragonfly a bug, for example.
So according to scientists, spiders are not insects, and you can't call dragonflies a bug. But hey, science itself is still studying and adding to what is known.
So there are over a million described species of insects. That is, there are over 1 million species that we know to exist or that have been documented to exist. It's estimated that there are probably around 5 to 6 million actual insects out there. Some estimates go way higher than that.
And how did insects manage to survive for eons and to become roughly 80% of the world's species? One advantage for many is wings and being able to fly. Another key way is their remarkable ability to adapt.
Metamorphosis is arguably the greatest key to the success of insects. That is probably the biggest thing that's allowed insects to diversify, adapt, and occupy so many different niches, is the ability to live one type of life at one point early on, as basically a baby, if you will, or a larva. And then they go through a complete cellular breakdown and to completely rebuild themselves into a different type of animal. That's amazing.
And the way insects communicate is also amazing.
Ants, for example, use chemical scents called pheromones. Each colony has a unique scent, allowing ants to recognize members of their own colony and sound the alarm when invaders are detected. And how do these tiny creatures find their way on foraging expeditions? Well, pheromone trails act as an ant's version of GPS, giving directions to food sources and then back home.
It's like when they're all going out here, it's like the world's most beautiful silent love song because the flashes are everywhere and it's just mesmerizing.
Capturing fireflies, or as many of us call them, lightning bugs, is a childhood summer ritual. But for fireflies, these light shows of bioluminescence are the way to attract mates. And here in Alabama, you may be lucky to see a rare synchronized light show of the species Photurus frontalis, where the males synchronize their flashing so that in the dark interludes between their flashing, they can see the dim responses of the wingless females on the ground.
They're not delicate little butterflies. Ultimately they're warriors, It would be hard for a human to make a 6,000-mile journey, let alone a butterfly, right?
While many species of insects fly, few rack up the air miles of migratory monarch butterflies, flying north in the spring to their breeding grounds and south in the fall to Mexico, where they overwinter. In the spring, 3 successive generations of a monarch family make the journey north, each generation living about 4 weeks, long enough to lay eggs and give birth to the next generation for the next leg of the journey. In the fall, shorter days and cooler temperatures trigger the birth of the fourth generation, also known as the super generation. Unlike the previous generations, the super generation lives up to 8 months and makes the marathon journey from the north all the way back to Mexico, overwintering and then laying eggs in the spring to start this wondrous life cycle anew.
Their journey is extraordinary. It is just one of the most amazing things about insect that I have ever encountered, because of the way they travel north and they live a very short cycle, but then that very last monarch knows, I have to live 5 to 9 months because I got to make it to Mexico and back. And it's just extraordinary to me how they know that when their parents and grandparents have never made that journey.
But perhaps one of the most amazing things about insects is what we learned in grade school, the critical ecological process of pollination.
So plants and pollinators have co-evolved. They have symbiotic relationships that, one can't exist without the other. So the plants have nectar. Bees need nectar and pollen, for example, other insects as well. But the plant has different signals that they send out. So it could be scent, it could be different colors, it could be different shapes of the flower. But some plants have things called nectar guides. And only bees and butterflies can really pick up on that because of the UV light that their eye receptors are able to see. And it looks like to the bee, it could look like a white flower to us in the human eye, but to the bee, it looks like these big flashing highway signs that are arrows pointing down to where the nectar and the pollen live within that flower.
And while we're talking about bees, there are 20,000 described species in the world, and about 4,000 species in the U.S. But here in Alabama,
we don't really know. Extensive surveys haven't been done in the state, but if we look at records from what we have from Alabama and what we have in Mississippi and Georgia, there could be upwards of 500 different bee species, and that doesn't include the honeybee.
But the pollinators doing most of the pollinating might not be the insects that first come to mind.
It's not always the honeybees and the butterflies doing the pollination service. It's the gnats, the beetles, the moths, all of these annoying sweat bees that are doing the pollination work.
The advance of insects over time and over continents has occurred in coevolution with the advance of natural habitats on Earth. And few places on Earth have such a diversity of natural habitats as our state, Alabama.
So we have habitat diversity, which leads to faunal and floral diversity, because plants and animals that become adapted to the landscape that they live in and the climate that they live in. Other places up north, you've had glaciation. It's only been 10,000 years since glaciers retreated. Out west, you have a lot of mountain building, a lot of very cold weather. Insects can adapt to that, but fewer do than in more moderate conditions.
Alabama's abundance of natural landscapes are dominated by exceptional diversity in two of the most environmentally important aspects, the abundance of water and an abundance of forests.
People think of forest, they think of a pine plantation, but I can assure you, Alabama's forest is so much more diverse than a pine plantation. The vast majority of it is natural, mixed pine hardwood stands.
And when you walk through and you look down at the wildflowers that are in a forest, you'll just see just hundreds of insects. And it could be flies, it could be butterflies, it could be bees, just so many different pollinators.
In Alabama, we have an extraordinary aquatic landscape. It's one of the most biologically rich in terms of the living organisms in rivers and streams in North America. We have the lower part of the Appalachian Mountains that meet the coastal plain. And that sets up this diversity of habitats. So the northeastern part of the state, which is the lower end of the Appalachian Mountains, has streams with bedrock, cobble, and gravel, whereas the coastal plain has what we call unconsolidated sediments, and that's essentially sand and some organic sediments like silt. And these differences set up really different habitats for the life of aquatic insects. We are what we call a diversity hotspot in terms of our riverine living organisms.
Alabama's plentiful woods and waters are the main reasons Alabama also has plentiful wildlife. And these days we're realizing that managing for the environmental health of our woods, waters, and wildlife means also managing for the health of insect populations.
Landowners can plant some pollinator plants, wildflowers effectively. And we normally recommend that they plant 3 early blooming species, 3 mid-summer blooming species, and 3 late summer or fall blooming species. That way it would carry pollinators throughout the entire growing season.
On the land and in the forest, we can support vital insect populations by actively managing for pollinator plants and by maintaining a variety of suitable insect habitats. For our aquatic areas, as Discovering Alabama has stressed in previous programs, the environmental health of our waters requires responsible management for the environmental health of our watersheds.
But sometimes activities in our human world can inadvertently bring serious problems to the natural world, bringing in non-native species, for example, that have no natural predators to keep them in check.
And of course, the classic example that anybody in Alabama can relate to is the red imported fire ant. And these came in the early 1900s on a coffee boat from Brazil, and has just taken over, the South, and outcompeted many different groups of ants and other insects, and has really impacted wildlife in a bad way.
And while we work to control the problem of invasive species, sustaining our native species and our native natural habitats is critically important in a very fundamental way: the pollination of our food crops.
So biodiversity is so important because just as a whole, we need multiple species in an area in order to safeguard our crops. And basically, more species that are out there pollinating our crops, the better our yields are going to be. About 2/3 of all food crops are actually dependent upon pollinators. So if we see large declines in these species, that could mean fewer amounts of food for us. All the vegetables, fruits, nuts, you wouldn't see those in the grocery store as much as you do now.
So if Alabama historically has had such a plenitude of native pollinating species, why then today is pollination so much dependent on the honeybee, which is actually a non-native species?
So we're relying on non-native honeybees to do the pollination service because native bees are ground nesting, and we've just totally decreased their habitats. They can't overwinter, they can't nest. We've overused pesticides to the point that we're killing these very sensitive native bees.
Most native bees are central place foragers, and they can't travel as far, so they really need floral resources in close proximity to where they nest. If there are no resources that they can fly to, that means that they basically starve to death. So we need to basically have floral resources in close proximity to where they're living. And if those resources aren't available, create them.
The millions of species of insects are a major biota of Earth. In many ways, they are the life pulse of our planet. They are also key indicators of how life is faring on the Earth's unique biosphere. And what they are telling us should be alarming. And yes, alarming even in regard to the big global issue of climate change.
We've definitely experienced late freezes this year and early freezes in the season. And what's happening is it's starting to trick some of the plants to either flower early or flower later. And insects are, connected to these plants. Some of them have one species of plant that they need to survive, that they need to eat and survive. And so you can imagine if that plant flowers early, then that insect comes out, 2 months later, and that plant isn't there for them.
And in Alabama, we're experiencing the classic environmental impacts that come as the human population increases and spreads. In many places, insects are retreating to the shrinking undisturbed lands that remain between light-drenched urban areas and chemically assisted agribusiness. And what about the decades ahead?
Really, my worst fear is the continued urbanization. I can see a time where Birmingham suburbs and Atlanta suburbs are going to merge, and we're going to lose a lot more habitat. We're already losing habitat on a daily basis, but it gets worse and worse every decade, and this state's going to almost be unrecognizable, I'm afraid.
One really good example that I like to explain to people is if you get up into an airplane and you look down, you see a lot of forests, but then you see they're broken up by farms and urbanization and roads. Well, what did that actually look like before we changed it? It used to be forests or natural areas, savannas, prairies, all of which contain native flowering plants that those pollinators absolutely depended upon. So we're seeing a big decline because of habitat loss.
In Alabama, we were blessed with an amazing landscape and natural resources, including living organisms in rivers and streams. But these living organisms can be threatened by human activities, which alter the amount of materials going into the streams, erosion, which brings about sedimentation in streams, which can smother organisms, as well as excess nutrients that come in from fertilizers or runoff from cities, as well as just the development of towns with its hardscape quality that alters water input into streams and the quality of that water. These are just some of the activities of humans that can affect living organisms in streams, including aquatic insects.
At a certain point, it's death by 1,000 cuts. They're getting hit by pesticides. They're getting hit by drought. They're getting hit by floods. They're getting hit by hurricanes. They're getting hit with deforestation. And then all of a sudden they're like, okay, I can't do it anymore, right? Like, that's it. They can't, they don't have enough resources to adapt to all of those changes.
If insects disappear, we're going to disappear. That's how critical they are to the success, or to not just the success, but to the livelihood of different animals, including ourselves. The planet will literally collapse as we know it without insects, because they're so foundational to all the animals and plants that are out there.
A recent study indicates as much as 40% of all insects could be facing serious decline in the next decade. And this is an immediate concern. But there are some immediate actions that can help. And sometimes it's relatively easy actions that we can take.
So bees need food and they need a place to live. And since most bees are ground nesting, providing a portion of your land that is undisturbed is extremely important. And then the other aspect, planting a diversity of wildflowers alongside your crops is really important, supporting your pollinator populations. And the farmers see benefits from that directly. They draw in pollinators that will spill over into their agricultural fields, boosting their yields. But also, those wildflower plantings will bring in natural enemies such as wasps that like to feed on the pests within those agricultural fields. So really, the farmer's just putting a small side of land aside, but they're seeing a lot of benefits from it.
And such advice can be applied in urban environments as well, by adding native plants into our community landscaping and in our yards and gardens.
But beyond the immediate actions we can take, Alabamians can give mindful consideration to the future and how best to control
the widespread environmental changes that may be coming our way. Changes that would surely have a dramatic impact in diminishing the state's unique biodiversity. For example, this is milkweed. It is the host plant for monarchs and is critical to their survival.
It is the only plant monarchs use to lay their eggs and is becoming less prevalent in our state. So, if you want future generations of our children to see the beauty of monarchs.
At present, all life known to exist in the universe is found only here on this warm blue orb. And all this life is enabled by the Earth's biosphere, a thin, life-supporting ecosystem profound among the otherwise harsh worlds of the stellar reaches. Essential to the life-sustaining wonder of our biosphere is the wondrous presence of insects.
Discovering Alabama is produced in partnership with Alabama Public Television. Discovering Alabama is a production of the Alabama Museum of Natural History. This program is supported by grants from the Solon and Martha Dixon Foundation and the Alabama Wildlife Federation, working for wildlife since 1935.